Hey, everybody, welcome to the Nate Whitson podcast. I'm your host. Today's a special show, and I'm sure it's going to quickly become a fan favorite. I know it's something that I have really been looking forward to for quite a while. I have the honor today of speaking with Professor Pearcey, Nancy Pearcey, who is an author of several books. Today, we're going to focus on one in particular, which is called The Toxic War on Masculinity and How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. She's also written books called Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and Total Truth. She's also a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University, has been quoted in the New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the top 5 women apologists by Christianity Today, and is hailed in the Economist as, quote, America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. It's a mouthful there. I am super grateful for her voice in the world, for her work, for her also graciously accepting to come on today. We've already had just a fun conversation before we've hit play even. So super excited to have you, Professor Pearcey. Thank you so much for doing this and being on the show today.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So excited to have you. And I just want to pick your brain and get as many things covered as we can in the time we have. And so if you're okay with it, we're just going to jump right in. And I would love to hear the backdrop. I don't remember this in the books that I've read of yours yet. I've read several, and maybe I've just missed it, but you're a leading voice on masculinity. And I'm so curious how that came to be, how, you've written the best-selling book, Toxic Masculinity, but what led you to investigating this, or kind of like this became your lane?
Well, first of all, I was just shocked at some of the hostility that it's become socially acceptable to express against men. One of the ones that just stuck in my mind was in the Washington Post, and it was an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And I thought, really? in a mainstream publication like that, a Huffington Post editor tweeted #KillAllMen, and then said it was a joke. Speaking of jokes, you can buy T-shirts that say, "So many men, so little ammunition." And books have come out with very blunt titles like "I Hate Men," and "No Good Men," and "Are Men Necessary?"
Wow.
And then what I found really tragic is that some men are also disparaging their own sex. There's a male book author who wrote a book in which he said, "Talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer." And then this one's not in my book because it's more recent, but you might have seen it in the news. The director of the movie Avatar was in the news saying, testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So this is what caught my eye. And I thought, really, why does the secular world get its concept of masculinity so wrong? Where's this coming from? You can't really stand against a social trend unless you know where it came from and how it developed. And so I wanted to show why the secular world is wrong, and I wanted to show why a biblical worldview is the solution.
Yeah. How did we get there? So, as you've done that, you're right. Like those are like such shocking titles and books and all of that. You're right. We're joking that so many men and so few ammunition as a joke. Like, how did we get so far away from what used to be normal and celebrated? How did we get here?
It is a long story because most people think the vocabulary of toxic masculinity is a product of maybe the 1960s, second wave feminism, but it actually goes much further back. You have to go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. That's when you see the first attacks on men. And here's why. Because before the Industrial Revolution, most men worked alongside their wife and their children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the social expectation on men focused much more on their caretaking role, responsibility for their family. Even secular historians will write things like this. One of them said, the colonial concept of masculine virtue was duty to God and man. Even the secular people realize that is a much higher view of masculine virtue.
Yes.
So the question then is, how did we lose that? And the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into offices and factories. And for the first time, they were not working with people that they loved and had a moral bond with, their wives and children, but they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that is a very different environment to be immersed in all day.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's when the language started to change. You see this in the literature of the day. People began to protest that men were changing, that they were losing that caretaking role, that they were becoming egocentric, self-centered, greedy, and acquisitive. This is the 19th century language.
Yes.
And even turning their career into an idol. I was surprised how often that was raised in the 19th century by people saying, look, your primary loyalty is supposed to be to God. And men are starting to make their primary loyalty now and get their identity and sense of worth from their job. And that was new, because jobs, up until then, jobs were not separate from family,
Right.
but now jobs were. And so they became almost sort of a competition with family, which I think we see today. I hear from people all the time who say, at work, they treat the family as competition.
Yes.
And that's when it began. And especially fathers, by the way, we are so used to fathers being out of the home all day that we don't realize what a trauma it caused at the time. Because if fathers were home all day, historians tell us that fathers spent as much time as mothers with their children, which today we can hardly even imagine.
Right. Yep.
In fact, most books on child rearing back then, books, sermons, advice manuals, were addressed to fathers. Whereas if you go to a typical bookstore today,
That's interesting.
by far the majority are to mothers.
Yes.
So even we have to have a sort of historical imagination to go back and say, if you look at the literature of the day, it's full of lament and outrage at the fact that fathers are no longer with their family all day. Parent Magazine, 1842, had an article in which they said the greatest sorrow of our day is that fathers can no longer be with their children, through most of the time. And one of them said, it's one of the tragedies of the American way of life that the father, the mainstay of the family, is no longer with his family throughout the day. Or the final quote that I really like is from the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, who was, historians tell us, she was the most influential woman of the 19th century. And here's what she said. She said, God is our father, but the prototype of the divine is away from his home from Sunday to Sunday. They didn't have Saturdays off yet.
Right.
But the father's out of the home most of the week. And so that's where we get sort of the negative view of fatherhood that we, in the media today, when fathers are mocked and ridiculed and made fun of, the from Dagwood Bumstead, if you remember him, to All in the Family.
Yes.
To Homer Simpson.
Homer, yeah.
So that negative view of the father, that he was, for the first time after the Industrial Revolution, he was out of the home. He was not in touch with the family dynamics. He no longer really understood what his children's thoughts and needs were. And already then, men began to be painted as, or fathers in particular, as out of touch, irrelevant, superfluous, and incompetent.
Yeah.
And all of that started in the 19th century. So if we want to have a solution, we have to see if, is there a way to have a better integration of fathers into their families?
That's so fascinating to consider. I hadn't thought that far back, and I certainly wouldn't have pinpointed it back there. It's very fascinating to think of, even in the 1800s. This started with actually kind of I think like a really accurate portrayal of the downfall is that men did disassociate from home. Instead of it being on the family farm, or they built families together, they work together as teams, they are separated, and it is still an issue, but the language becomes very dramatic, to where you had mentioned it earlier, even where testosterone itself it's toxic, right? So we've gone from this like maybe legitimate recognition that men are now separated from their home and it's not a good thing, to, wow, like men themselves are, bad.
I agree. I think that we have to realize that the male character did change. By the way, here's the other element. There's two elements here. The other one is that society was secularizing in the 1800s, 19th century. And if this too was part of the Industrial Revolution, because after that, there arose a huge public sphere with factories and offices and banks and universities and, of course, the state. And in this public realm, people began to say these large institutions should be operated by scientific principles, by which they meant value free.
Yes.
Which is what we still hear today, right? Don't bring your private values into the public realm.
That's right. And
so it was mostly men who were working in that more secularized environment and getting that secular education. And so men were becoming secular historically earlier than women did.
Mm-hmm.
And that added to this because, of course, then they were not feeling as bound by Christian morality.
Mm-hmm.
And many people say this is one reason the 19th century saw a huge increase in what are sort of traditionally masculine vices like drinking, gambling, fighting, crime, gang activity, and prostitution.
Yes.
And so many historians talk about the huge array of reform movements that arose in the 19th century, all in response to the fact that men were not behaving by biblical principles anymore. Let me give you one fact just because I can crystallize it. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today.
Is that right?
So there was a reason for the reform movements, including the temperance movement.
Yeah.
Because men were drinking away their wages and leaving their wives and children destitute and things like that. So it's historians talk about the wide range of reform movements as the benevolent empire.
Uh-huh.
There's so many interconnected reform movements that they call it the benevolent empire, but it was all in response to the fact that men were becoming secular and were not living up to Christian morality as much as they had in the past.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that still today. I think it's really very interesting. Let me ask you this question, then we'll talk about let's talk about the women who, certainly play a role in trying to kind of feminize men, in terms of feminist conversations here. Let's say that you could sit down with a group of secular feminists who believe that masculinity really is inherently toxic, like we're talking about here. What would you say to them in the first 5 minutes that you had with them to maybe counter that?
Yeah, women come up with it for 2 main reasons. One of them is, let's face it, some of them had very negative relationships with men. Mm-hmm. I think that's the most common reason. And it's one reason I started my book with my own experience. The introduction is that my father was severely physically abusive. Mm-hmm. And in books on abuse, they sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist? And it was closed fist. His favorite was the knuckle fist, the middle finger extended, which causes a sharper stab of pain. So a good deal of my whole life has been spent getting emotional, psychological, and spiritual healing from my past. But when I left home, when I became a young adult, I ricocheted off into extreme feminism. I read all the feminist books. I read all the foundational books, Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir. I just thought they were wonderful. I loved them. And so I went through a period of that, of being a strong feminist. And then I became a Christian and I had to start rethinking this whole thing. But as a result, I would start with probably empathizing with women who've had bad experiences with men, because it is more common. I mean, violence of men against women is more common than violence of women against men. Domestic violence is, according to the CDC, domestic violence is the greatest cause of women being hospitalized. Domestic violence is also, let me see if I get the statistic right. 50% of female homicides, in other words, women who are murdered, 50% of female homicides are by domestic partners. That means husbands, former husbands, live-in boyfriends, or former
lovers.
boyfriends.
Yep.
50%, that's half.
Yeah, it's wild.
Half of women murders are by men. So we do have to start, I think, with understanding that many women have psychological reasons. But you know what the second reason is? The second reason is they're just learning it from their culture. I was recently talking to a woman she's the wife of a pastor, and their daughter went off to a Christian school, Christian college. First time coming home, she announced to her mother that all men are toxic.
Wow. No kidding.
And then she was shocked that her mother didn't agree. Like, of course, isn't that what all rational people think? Once you go to college, this is what you learn.
Right.
She was shocked that her mother disagreed with her. And I thought, okay, that's a case where the intergenerational message is going to women who've not had negative experiences with men. They're just picking it up as the correct view, the accepted view in our secular culture today.
Yes.
So that was kind of surprising. A woman from a very loving, secure Christian home was still susceptible to picking up that message when she went off to college.
Yeah, that's so tragic. I think it's really interesting that you mentioned starting the conversation with empathy. That's so wise. truly? Because if the point of sitting down with somebody was just to win an argument, that's not a very fun conversation anyways. But if we wanted somebody to truly see the point that we feel, like why we disagree with this point that toxic or that masculinity is toxic, empathy is a great wall breaker. I think that's really wise to go that way.
Yeah, and people who read my book, The Toxic War in Masculinity, have often said, well, I'm so glad you started with this, because it does mean you've been there. Here's how one Christian psychologist interviewed me, and he said, well, at least we know you're not writing from an ivory tower. You're writing from the trenches.
Exactly.
And so what I tell people is we live in the age of Oprah, confessional, where that's how you get your street cred.
Yes, exactly.
Is that you've been there. So, yeah, I couldn't write this book until my father passed away. I wasn't going to write it when he was still alive.
Yeah.
But now, I feel okay about going public with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, truly, you are in the trenches with your story and with just having walked that journey of feminism, and then can write on that with just true understanding and eyes clearly wide open to this. Let's imagine this. Let's imagine that maybe you could rewrite history and you could take Christianity's influence on masculinity out of the picture, right? So Christianity's influence on masculinity's out. What do you think that masculinity would look like today? Would it be better? Would it be worse? Would it be the same? What do you think would happen if we took that out?
The best way to answer that is to say, what happened when Christianity appeared on the scene? What was the view of men at the time?
Okay. Yeah.
So that's probably what would have continued if Christianity hadn't appeared. So we're talking about Greco-Roman culture. Greco-Roman culture had an extremely toxic view of masculinity. Men, it was totally acceptable that men would have sex with anybody, with mistresses, with courtesans, with prostitutes, and most of all with their own slaves. Slaves were handy. Horace, well-regarded historical figures like Horace literally says, I like my sex easy and accessible. And so I'll usually grab a nearby slave boy. He said slave boy, because homosexuality was also completely accepted.
Yes.
In fact, there are, for public debates, there are certain common topics. Like today we might debate immigration. One of their debate topics is sex with men better or sex with women?
Wow.
Which means a good portion of the population was arguing for sex with men. It was more pleasurable. There was even a Roman poet who I quote in my book. I had to read some of this stuff. I could only take in small doses. It was a book called Roman Homosexuality, an academic study. At any rate, one of the examples it gave was a poet who admonished women not to be jealous when their husbands preferred having sex with their boy slaves.
Wow.
And he literally said, everyone knows that sex with boys is more pleasurable than sex with women. And so, so he was scolding wives for being jealous. And so that was, what else can I say about ancient Rome? They also had a very, very low view of children. Children were considered non-persons. It was customary to beat them. And of course, both abortion and infanticide were widely practiced. And a low view of children often goes with a low view of women. Because bearing children takes up a good bit of women's adult life. And so, and because this was actually one of the historians I read, he said women were also denigrated because they had a natural tendency to have a greater emotional attachment to women. Well, if children are devalued, then anyone who is attached to them is attached to something that's not valued. Right. And so it was a way of denigrating women, too, to say that they had a special affinity for children. So all that to say, women flocked to the early church. There were more women than men in the early church, and it's because women especially benefited from the Christian sex ethic. They understood that when the church stood against abortion and infanticide, that was the way that Christians expressed the high value and dignity that they gave to women's biological function. Especially in pre-modern societies, right? They don't have birth control, so women would often be they were either pregnant, nursing, or had babes in arms pretty much all the time. So women flocked to the church because they recognized that the church's view on abortion and infanticide valued women. They realized that the church's sex ethic held men to the same standard as women, namely fidelity in chastity outside marriage,
Yeah.
faithfulness in marriage, and of course, no sex with your slaves.
Right.
What we don't usually hear, though, I think we should, is that this was very hard to eradicate. Augustine in the fourth century was still telling husbands to stop sleeping with their slaves.
Mm.
And he has
Yeah.
a quote from Augustine where I have a quote where Augustine says, that the wives might challenge their husbands and say, come on, we both heard it in church today.
Mm-hmm.
The pastor said that you owe me fidelity. You're asking me fidelity. You owe me the same. And Augustine said, when the wives grumble like this, the husbands may become abusive because they don't like being held to accountability. But Augustine was not the only one. There are a couple of other church fathers too. So that clearly these were practices that were very difficult to eradicate. And so this is where we would have been. We would have been like the ancient Romans.
So fascinating. Hey guys, I wanted to take a quick break from the show to share with you 3 things that I think could help you to become more of the man that God meant for you to be: a better husband, a better father, and a better follower of Jesus Christ. 3 things, totally free, that I think can help you. Number 1 is our podcast. Hit the subscribe button, share them with a friend. That makes a big difference, not only in your life, but in somebody else that you care about as well. And it helps us to reach more men. Number 2, we do a free weekly newsletter that is short, it's concise, it deals with just one key question and then 3 simple action items each week that will help you to get in the fight in a really practical way. You can find that at getinthefight.club/newsletter. And then lastly, you can join our Fight Club community. This is a free private app for Christian men only, where you can talk to guys and get involved with guys' lives from all around the world who are just like you, trying to get in the fight to be better men for Christ. You get things like daily devos, weekly challenges, monthly gatherings, small groups, so much more. It's kind of like a Facebook group, but exclusively for Christian men, and it's totally awesome, and it's totally free. getinthefight.club/join and check it out. Get more today. So subscribe to the YouTube channel, get our newsletter, get involved in our Fight Club. Totally free things to help you to get in the fight and win today. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for listening. Back to the show. It really makes me think of all the scriptures where there's neither Jew nor Greek nor slave, that we are all one, was so radical to your point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the very idea that women had the same value as men. And there was some church fathers. Do you remember the verse where Paul says that being single can be a value, especially when you're under persecution?
Yes.
In 1 Corinthians. And he said, after all, a single man is devoted to the Lord and wants to know how to please the Lord. But a married man, wants to please his wife.
That's right.
There were church fathers who said, oh, surely he didn't mean that. What husband wants to please his wife?
Interesting. Right.
That was it was so different from what they had been raised on. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a book years ago, What If Jesus Had Never Been Born?
Oh, yeah. I know that book.
If you're familiar with it, but that was one that kind of just really radically just changed my mind. And it's kind of, again, it's when an author like yourself or like this other one, I think it was Mr. Kennedy who wrote that said, that teaches us historical perspective. It's really hard for us today in 2025 to understand the things that you're saying. Like, I can't even put my head around that was the way it was. But man, Christianity was so radical, and it was such a light. It was such a beautiful light to the world that, again, that women would flock to it, that they had dignity and value. And that was the thing. It feels to me like that ought to still be the good news today.
Isn't it? Yeah. I think one of the things that we need to do when we live in the Western culture is to extract Christianity from the background. It's almost become the wallpaper.
Mm-hmm.
And we think, oh, well, everyone thinks this way, right? All enlightened people have a high view of women, for example. There's a historian today. Have you heard of Tom Holland? Tom Holland, not the actor.
Just say, I think I do know Tom Holland. Probably a different one that I know.
It's a British historian.
Okay.
And he started out, from the time he was a kid, he loved the ancient Greeks and Romans. He loved the armor and the lances and the swords, typical. And he actually wrote several very well-respected histories of the ancient world. And then he said, well, why don't I do Christianity? And when he did a history of Christianity, his whole mentality changed. He said, you know what? I'm a Christian. In all of my background beliefs. He wasn't personally committed, but he realized all of his background beliefs were Christian. He said, my understanding of morality and human dignity and human rights, they didn't have any of that in the ancient world.
That's right.
I mean, I've written the books. I know they did not have that view. They did not have humility was not even considered a virtue in the ancient world. Humility was a bad thing. The best virtue is magnanimity, meaning it means great soul. It means I think I'm wonderful. That was the virtue, is to have that kind of pride. And so they didn't have humility. They did not have charity for the poor and the weak. No, they valued only the strong and the powerful, and the weak. Well, who cares about them?
Right.
And so when Tom Holland wrote this, he wrote the book called, the name of it is Dominion. And that's where he says, I finally realized that culturally speaking, I am a Christian. And by the way, he's considering now actually converting.
Is he really?
When he's realized he's so close.
He's so close.
That he has been attending church and investigating Christianity on a personal level. But it all started when he realized my whole background beliefs about things like the value of human life and so on, all are Christian. And even Richard Dawkins, Richard Dawkins,
yes,
right?
Yes, very familiar.
Who's been a very outspoken secular atheist scientist. He said the same thing. He's finally said, you know what, culturally speaking, I am a Christian. All of my background beliefs are Christian too.
Yes.
So they're beginning to realize that we didn't recognize the Christian impact when it sort of blended in with the whole background, like the wallpaper.
Agreed.
I think one of the most important things we can do to encourage Christians is to help them to realize how unique Christianity really is.
So radical. Well, let's build on that then. What does the Bible say then about masculinity, and how does that differ from maybe the stereotypes?
What I did in my book, The Toxic Masculinity, was look at what the sociological data says about Christian men and how they differ from secular men. Because the standard media narrative is that Christian men are, if anything, exhibit A of toxic masculinity. Right. And that the concept, any sort of notion of male headship in the home, for example, leads men to become overbearing, tyrannical, oppressive patriarchs. In fact, let me give you just one quote. They were easy to find, but this was the founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement.
Okay.
And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So what happened is the social scientists were listening to this and saying, well, where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they did the studies, and I quote about a dozen different studies in my book. And what they found out is that evangelical Christian men who are committed, who attend church regularly, actually are the most loving and committed husbands and fathers. For example, they are the most loving to their wives. And yes, the wives are interviewed separately.
Good point.
Always get asked that.
That's right, yeah.
So what they're really saying is the wives report the highest level of happiness.
That's right.
With the way their husbands treat them. They spend more time with their children than secular men, 3.5 hours more per week than secular men. They have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular couples. And the real shock is they have the lowest rate of domestic violence and abuse of any major group in America. So let me give you a quote on this, just because quotes help us crystallize it. The person who did the largest study was Brad Wilcox, who is at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he does get invited to write for places like the New York Times. So this was an article in the New York Times. And what he said was, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And so this is the data. This is not a pep talk from some religious leader. This is solid empirical findings. And so we should be very bold about bringing this in, first of all, into the church. Because this material is not well known in the church. If you read my endnotes, you'll see that they're all academic journal articles.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't made its way out of the academic world yet.
Yes.
So we need to bring it into the churches. And then, of course, we also need to be very confident bringing it into the public arena as well, in showing that Christianity really does reconcile the sexes.
That's right.
As I put it in my subtitle.
That's right. Well, and again, thank you for coming on the show, because that's truly what this is about. It's about bringing the wisdom from the educational side, from where you sit, to bring it to us, to bring it to the masses. That's why the book has been a bestseller. It's why the conversation is resonating. I think there's like an awareness that's happening culturally through things like simple podcasts like this one, and different mediums today, where people are pushing back against and going like, well, show me the evidence, just to what you just described there with Brad. I think it's so good. Like, okay, this is what you're saying, but is this true? And one thing that's fascinating to me is like, we're seeing young, and maybe you can verify if this is true or not, but we're seeing young men become more conservative, not necessarily Christian, but young men coming out of colleges today becoming more conservative than ever. But we see women becoming even more secular, which I think is very fascinating, even to the point of the daughter of the pastor who came back from a Christian college, quote unquote, feeling that way. So I think it's really interesting, the cultural things that are happening here, but we have to have these conversations about this. And in fact, what I'll ask you out of that question is this: like, you've said that the idea of toxic masculinity is often misunderstood. I think that's really interesting. What do you think the biggest misconception is that people have about masculinity?
You know, I was as surprised as anyone when I started actually doing the research and finding, very encouraging findings. Let me give you one. We talked about Christian men, but men around the world have an understanding of what it means to be a good man, to use your masculinity for good. Let me give you two studies. One was by an anthropologist. He did the first ever study of cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
And what he found is that all around the world, there's a uniform understanding that a good man does what he called the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate, meaning become a father. Right?
Yep.
Build into the next generation.
Yep.
And I thought, well, that's very encouraging, because these were not necessarily nations with a Christian background. This was a global study. And he was able to find that innately, universally, men do understand that their unique masculine strengths are given them not just to get whatever they want, but to protect, to provide for, to care for those that they love. And that's very encouraging, that in spite of, in spite of all the messages of toxicity, men have that deep internal knowledge. The second study was by a sociologist, and he found that men today are often caught between two conflicting scripts. In fact, I put this right at the front of my book because, like you said, people are confused about what masculinity even is.
Yes.
And with all of my books, I have a lot of reading groups to sort of get feedback before it goes to press. And they would tell their family and friends that they were going through a manuscript on masculinity. And invariably, the first question was, whose side is she on? Invariably.
Interesting.
A very defensive reaction.
Yeah.
And most men assumed that a woman writing a book on masculinity would be a male-bashing feminist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And on the other side, they thought I was sort of the red pill reactionary.
Interesting. Yeah.
So this study actually went right at the front of the book, and what he found was this. Again, he's so well known, this sociologist, that he speaks all around the world. So again, this is international, and he came up with a clever experiment where he asked young men 2 questions. First, he said, "What does it mean to be a good man?" If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And he said immediately, all around the world, young men would start listing things like honor, duty, sacrifice, integrity, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be responsible, be generous. All around the world, they're made in God's image. This is the Christian understanding, right? That they're made in God's image. And so even non-Christian sociologists in non-Christian countries finds that men know exactly what it means to be a good man.
Yes.
But then he would follow up with a second question, which was this. He said, what if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men themselves would say, oh, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain,
Yeah.
be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language.
Mm-hmm.
And so this sociologist concluded that many men are trapped between these two contradictory scripts, what they call the good man,
Yes.
which is innate and universal, which is very encouraging.
Yes.
But they often feel a cultural pressure to be what the young man themselves called the real man, which is not that they're all bad. I mean, we want people who can hang tough
Yes.
in a crisis.
Yes.
But if disconnected from a moral vision, it can slide into the traits that we now call toxic, the Andrew Tate phenomenon.
Yes.
Fast cars, fast money, fast women.
Yes.
So I thought that was very helpful because it means that, on the one hand, look, it doesn't do much good to call people toxic. Most men do not respond very well to that.
That's right.
So what we should do is, how can we affirm, support, and encourage that innate knowledge that they have about what it means to be a good man? And then harness that, in a sense, to help them, overcome whatever toxic things out in our culture. But start by affirming what they already do know. We know they're made in God's image.
Innately.
And in Romans 2, right? Even people without the law do have a law, written on their hearts.
Written on their hearts. Yep. That's right.
So that gives us a much more positive way to approach these issues.
No, I think that's great. It reminds me, actually, you quote somebody else in your book saying that masculinity without morality is lethal, but masculinity constrained by morality is powerful and constructive and actually a gift to women. I love that quote. I thought that was really great. And it's really kind of what we're saying, right? Like what does it mean, I guess, for masculinity to be constrained by morality? Maybe like build further into that.
Yeah, so that was actually a quote from a feminist.
Okay.
But she calls herself a rational feminist.
Okay. There you go.
she disagrees with some of the extremes of feminism. But her point was, even as a feminist, she can affirm, that masculinity, when it's constrained by morality, is a good gift to women. Is God's gift to women. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to do more, I think, in the Christian church, because even the church picks up these messages, right? When I first told my graduate class, that I was writing a book on masculinity, one of the male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." So I thought, whoa, even in a Christian church. Or listen to this one. This is, again, in my graduate class, one of the women was the head of a women's ministry at a very large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. So even the Christian church has often taken a more negative stance in their way of trying to encourage men. Like as if trying to encourage them, negatively.
Right.
And actually, even the divorce statistics, when I say that Christian men have a 35% lower rate of divorce, again, the first pushback I always get is, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture?
Yeah.
And in fact, that is one of the most widely stated statistics by Christian leaders, it turns out.
Yes.
And which actually kind of gets us into a slightly different subject, which is where is that coming from? The sociologists went back to the data and they made a very important distinction between men who are, in fact, very committed and attend church regularly.
Yes.
And the nominal Christian men.
Yes.
And my students don't even know what the word nominal is. So I say NOM is Latin for name. So it means in name only.
In name only, yep.
So in surveys, these men might check, say, the Baptist box, but it's just a matter of family background and culture and so on.
That's right.
And these men test out shockingly different. They actually have all the negative toxic stereotypes.
Yep.
Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They spend the least amount of time with their kids. They have the highest rate of divorce, 20% higher than secular couples. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America.
Yep.
The same Brad Wilcox from the University of Virginia wrote in Christianity Today. He said, the most violent husbands in America are nominal evangelical Protestant men. So this is what the church is also up against. How can we bring the good news to the churches? But how do we reach out in discipleship to these nominal men who apparently hang around the edges of the Christian world enough to get the language of headship and submission, but not enough to get the true meaning of those words? I think that's a mission field that the church has to acknowledge that's out there, and that they're responsible for, because these guys are, identifying as Christians.
Yep.
And then their behavior is, even more toxic than secular men. So they're the ones, you might say that they're the ones who are kind of ruining the reputation of Christian men. And so I think that the church needs to really think hard about how to reach out to nominals and disciple them effectively.
Yeah, I think it's where, we were mentioning a few different men's ministries before we pushed record here. And then this one myself, again, is Get in the Fight, is to help Christian men become better husbands, fathers, and followers of Jesus. And it really falls right in line with this. I think you're seeing a lot of things like my own ministry to Christian men in particular spring up in response to this, to say there is this innate sense that I want to be a good man, but I don't know how to define it in terms. So like we have in our ministry here 4 principles that we kind of hammer through all the time, but to be men of honor, to be men of discipline, to be men of strength, and then we clarify those areas spiritually, relationally, sexually, things like that. But then also to be men of joy. Those are the 4 categories that we kind of just we bridge all of those and say, man, when you look at the life of Christ and what it was like to actually be the best man who's ever lived, he embodied honor, discipline, strength, and joy. Anyways, and so we kind of we're pushing against this cultural thing through ministries like this, and again having conversations like this with you today.
Yeah, and when you bring the social science data in, it's just one more way of saying, look, God's design actually works.
Yes, exactly right.
If you organize your marriage and your family by God's design, you've got the backing of social science now to tell you it works. It's what makes not only women and children happier, but it makes the men themselves happier. Because of course they interviewed the men too.
Yes.
And Christian men tested out as reporting the highest level of happiness.
Nancy, thank you for joining the show today. It was so great to have you. Everybody, please make sure you go to Amazon. You can check out The Toxic War on Masculinity. We'll put links to the book in the show notes as well. But what a great conversation. Make sure that you subscribe, follow, and if you enjoyed this one, please maybe share it with a friend. But that's it for today. We'll see you soon. Go get in the fight. We'll talk to you later. Hey guys, thanks so much for being here today and listening to the show. Please be sure to head over to the website at getinthefight.club. And before you go, if you haven't already, please subscribe, click the like button, and leave us a positive 5-star review. It makes a huge difference whenever you do. Have a great day. Go get in the fight.